Thank you, Ceann Comhairle. Taoiseach, a fairly difficult question for you, but one that the Irish public needs asked today as we return from the summer recess. What's the government's plan regarding COVID? Are we going to suppress it? Try to? Contain it, maybe? Are we going to try and eliminate it? Because COVID obviously came to us in this country from a climate point of view at the best time for us. We're now heading into 6 months of grave difficulty. So the public need to know from you. You've had all summer to think about it, so I presume you'll have an answer. They need to have a vision. The previous Taoiseach set out a vision, set out a roadmap. Will you do so now in reply to me? You know, a signal today, we've 221 people on trolleys across the country. It's a signal, and it's only the 2nd of September. What will it be like on the 2nd of December? How are we going to ensure that the elderly in this country actually have a life to live? We all know we're going to be facing into this for at least another year, year and a half potentially, maybe longer. They have to be allowed to live. How are we going to ensure that those people with disabilities, the most vulnerable in our society, have a life to live, have access to the treatments and access to the stimulations that they need? With that in mind, Taoiseach, yesterday my party published a bill to provide sick leave and parental leave for workers. I'm asking you to support this wholeheartedly. Your CMO and the Chief Executive of the HSE have both called for this. We cannot have a situation where we're one of only 5 countries, Cyprus, Denmark, Greece and Portugal, that doesn't have this on a statutory basis. We can't have a situation where workers who are going into meat plants or other settings are taking paracetamol or, dare I say, Calpol to hide their temperature. If they have a choice between going to work with a symptom of COVID or not getting paid, it's a fairly stark choice. That needs to be eliminated for the workers, but for society. You have to do this. It is no choice as regards where we are with COVID and this virus. Otherwise, you cannot have credibility if you're asking other counties, like the 3 counties that went into lockdown, and say, we need you to lock down, but we did not provide or ensure that there was sick pay for low-paid workers who had very little choices as regards going into work or not, very stark choices. Of course they shouldn't, but otherwise they wouldn't get paid. And we also need to ensure that all parents who have children going back to school this week and last and next week, that if one of their children, and we know that 30 in one school this week had to leave, that those parents or guardians, that they know that they can get paid for the duration, just the duration of the time that the school is closed. Thank you, Deputy. Because what alternative have they? So, Taoiseach, I would ask you, what is the plan? And secondly, will you ensure, which is an absolutely essential issue as far as we are concerned, and we've written to all political parties in here to ask for support for this, will you bring in provision for sick pay on a statutory basis and ensure there is parental leave for parents whose children are in schools affected by COVID?
Thank you very much. Taoiseach.
Yeah, first of all, the Deputy has answered about 3 key points in the one leader's questions, which I've noted and I'll deal with. The government's plan is to suppress the virus. And from the get-go, from the very, very beginning, all political parties in this House took it as a basic principle that we would go with the advice of the public health authorities. That was accepted in this House. I'm not so sure it's accepted as much anymore, if the truth be told. And maybe you should say what your views on that are, because I think that is fundamental. And we had a lot of consensus from the outset of the pandemic because there was a consensus around taking on board the advice of not just the Chief Medical Officer, but NEFIT and the broader public health. And I actually think it served us well. And if you look at comparators around Europe and internationally, those countries that, broadly speaking, I'm not saying every single letter of the guideline issue, but broadly speaking, those countries that followed public health advice did much better in terms of mortality, and in terms of illness and cases than those that choose to ignore initially public health advice. And we'd all do well to reflect on that, because I sensed the rush to try and dispense with this rule and that rule and every other instruction or advice that comes our way, because instinctively we want to break free from the impact and the restraints and restrictions of this pandemic. But it's easier said than done. So we want to suppress it, but we want to live with it. And the government will be producing a plan towards about the middle of September, which we'll bring to the Dáil, which will create a framework around which we can live with the virus. As I said last week, we want to protect above all lives, but we also want to protect livelihoods. That is key, in my view. And as I said earlier, we're monitoring the economic fallout. It is very significant, very significant. We can't be blind to the reality of a 25 billion to 30 billion deficit this year, further significant borrowing throughout 2021 to maintain and sustain the supports we have and different sectors of the economy. Those are the realities. So there's a very strong economic dimension to this that we can't ignore. It doesn't ultimately trump the health dynamic, which is essentially to protect lives and save people. But we've learned a lot from the first phase. We had to suspend elements of the reopening of the roadmap because public health advice said it's important that you do that. And the 3 local lockdowns, as they're called, but they weren't quite the same lockdown as the national one earlier in terms of Laois, Offaly and Kildare, they worked, by the way. And we thank the people of those counties who suffered a lot in implementing and living with those severe restrictions that were introduced. But the outcome from the public health perspective is that they actually worked in reducing and getting the case numbers down. We need to learn lessons from that. And I know the local deputies, and I want to thank all the deputies from all parties in those counties who took a lot of heat, and a lot of public representatives did, but who worked with health and others and public expenditure to see what we could do to help people in those situations. And in terms of the sick, very quickly, I'm sorry I've gone over time, but in terms of the sick pay, we will work constructively with you, Deputy, in relation to that legislation. It has a lot of implications, financially, of course, but we've already moved ahead with the COVID. We've created an infrastructure around COVID illness payments, particularly in direct provision, yes, in direct provision, and in terms of meat plans, to make it very, very clear that every worker in such situations will get sick pay. But I take your point in terms of the legislation you're talking about. It's to create a more permanent provision around sick pay and the right to sick pay for workers.
Thank you, Taoiseach. I'm glad you've actually, for the first time, outlined the date as regards when you're going to publish a plan. You had all summer, but I do welcome the fact that it will be with us now in 2 weeks' time. We'll have to wait for that. I'm glad you're on the record. You put a challenge to me. Are we all following public health advice? The reason I'm raising the issue of sick pay and parental leave is because the CMO raised it himself last Thursday. Sick pay is an absolutely incremental issue when it comes to potential spread of COVID, and particularly the clusters. People are going into work who shouldn't be going into work. Basic, simple as that. They need to be taken on. We need to ensure there's a legislative provision, that there's a statutory scheme to ensure that workers don't have to make that choice, whether not to get paid or go in with symptoms of COVID. It's basic, it's simple, it's necessary. The CMO has called for it. The head of the HSE has called for it. Like, you're asking us all to follow public health advice, and we are, and you're always saying we should. You now need to follow the advice on this specific issue. Workers don't need to be going into situations which is putting society in a vulnerable place. And the way in which to deal with that is to ensure that there is proper provision of sick pay across the board, particularly in low-paid jobs. And we all know that there are many employments, large-scale employments, where clusters are being created where there is no sick pay. For instance, in the meat industry, I was contacted by a representative of one of the groups when there was an outbreak in my own county. I asked 4 questions, Crown Corley, relating to sick pay. 2 weeks later, they still haven't come back to me. I understand that you have to have a contract of over a year before you'll even be considered for something like that, while a lot of the contracts are less than a year. So workers are going to go in to environments that they shouldn't be going into because they will not get paid otherwise. You need to deal with this. This is a public health issue as well as a workers' rights issue.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach, to conclude.
I have dealt with it. I have dealt with it. You have a tendency to develop a melodramatic posture when you're addressing people from time to time. But the reality is the government has introduced it. But you have, the government have introduced the COVID-19 illness benefit. It's available at €330 per week to employed and self-employed workers. It's paid for 2 weeks where a person is medically certified as self-isolating, which can be extended for a further 2 weeks and for a maximum of 10 weeks where a person is medically certified as being diagnosed with COVID-19. Furthermore, we extended this payment to workers who live in direct provision because of issues. I've spoken with the CMO over a month ago about this. And hold on. And last month, the government also approved the extension of COVID-19 illness benefit to the end of March 2021. And it's important to note as well that the COVID-19 illness benefit payment, the pandemic unemployment payment, is also available to people living in direct provision centres, as well as applicants for international protection who live in the community outside of the direct provision system. And I've asked, and I've spoken with Heather Humphreys, Department of Social Protection. We've discussed this over a month ago. How do we get into direct provision centres, into the meat plants, to make sure the workers know their rights and entitlements so that they don't fear having to put their hand up to say that they have symptoms? I know that. I'm as well aware of it, and I accept the necessity to intervene here. And I think we're all agreed on that. And as I said to you, I would constructively engage with your legislation, which is a more longer-term implications in terms of the broader workforce. But the key point, we have intervened. We have intervened in terms of direct provision. We have intervened. Sorry, we've discussed this with the CMO. We're collectively on the one page in relation to this, and we've made provision for it from the state side, so that workers know that if they get sick, have to self-isolate, that they will not lose out. And that's something we will have communicated, we continue to communicate with.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach.